Sarah Miller clutched her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as the bitter October wind of 1878 cut through the makeshift shelter she'd constructed beside the train tracks. Her 3 children, Emma, age 7, Thomas, 5, and little Abigail, barely 3, slept huddled together under the only blanket they possessed, their breaths forming small clouds in the chilly Wyoming air. The distant whistle of a train echoed across the plains, a cruel reminder of how far they had fallen since her husband's death 8 months ago. The moonlight cast long shadows across the empty prairie as Sarah kept watch, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. 3 days they'd been here. 3 days since they'd been evicted from their rented room in Laramie when the last of Robert's savings had run out. Now, with winter approaching and nowhere to go, the train tracks had become their only refuge, a desperate hope that perhaps they could find passage to somewhere new. Somewhere with work for a widow with 3 young mouths to feed. A rustling sound from beyond their small camp made Sarah stiffen. She reached for the small knife tucked in her boot, the only protection she had. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and she positioned herself between the noise and her sleeping children. "Hello there," a deep voice called out, low enough not to startle but clear enough to be heard. "I mean no harm." The silhouette of a man on horseback emerged from the darkness. As he drew closer, Sarah could make out his features in the moonlight, a strong jawline shadowed by several days' worth of beard, a weather-worn face beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and eyes that seemed to assess their situation in an instant. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat as he dismounted his horse with fluid grace, "forgive the intrusion, but it ain't safe for you and your little ones out here." "We're fine," Sarah replied, though her voice betrayed her fear and exhaustion, "just resting before moving on tomorrow." The stranger's gaze traveled from her face to the sleeping children, then back to her. "Name's Flynn Callahan," he said. "Got a ranch about 3 miles east of here, too dangerous for young ones by these tracks. Coyotes been bold lately, and the night trains don't always see folks camping this close." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I know you don't know me from Adam, but I got a warm house, food to spare, and a spare room that ain't being used. You and your children could come home with me, at least until you figure your next steps." Sarah stared at him, suspicion warring with desperation. "Why would you help strangers?" Flynn Callahan's expression softened. "Lost my sister and her young ones to a harsh winter when her husband passed." "No one stopped to help them." He looked away briefly. "I reckon some debts can only be paid forward." In that moment, with her children shivering despite the blanket, Sarah made a decision that would change all their lives forever. "My name is Sarah Miller," she said finally. "And these are my children." "Well, Mrs. Miller," Flynn replied, a gentle smile crossing his face, "what do you say we get these little ones somewhere warm for the night?" Sarah nodded, feeling both trepidation and relief as she moved to wake her sleeping children. The journey to Flynn Callahan's ranch was made mostly in silence, with Sarah riding behind Flynn on his horse while her 2 older children rode double on a second horse he'd brought. Little Abigail slept cradled in Sarah's arms, mercifully unaware of their desperate circumstances. As they crested a small rise, the ranch came into view in the moonlight, a sturdy 2-story house with a wide porch, a large barn, and several outbuildings. It wasn't grand, but to Sarah's eyes, it looked like a palace compared to their train-side camp. "It ain't much," Flynn said, seeming to read her thoughts, "but it's solid and warm." "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered, and meant it. Inside, the house was simple but well kept. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the smell of something savory lingered in the air. "Mrs. Peabody comes by to cook and clean a few days a week," Flynn explained as he helped them settle in. "She'll be pleased to have someone to fuss over besides me." That first night, after her children were bathed, fed, and tucked into real beds for the first time in weeks, Sarah sat across from Flynn at his kitchen table, cradling a cup of hot coffee between her trembling hands. "I can work," she said suddenly. "I'm good with a needle and I can cook and clean. I don't expect charity." Flynn leaned back in his chair. No one's offering charity, Mrs. Miller. Ranch this size needs more hands than just mine. You stay and help where you can and we'll call it fair. For how long? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Flynn's blue eyes held her steady. For as long as you need. No rush, no pressure. When you're ready to move on, I'll help you get where you're going. Sarah nodded, fighting back tears of relief. Thank you, she managed. Flynn simply nodded. Get some rest. Tomorrow's soon enough to figure the rest. As Sarah lay in bed that night, listening to her children's peaceful breathing in the unfamiliar but comfortable room, she wondered what twist of fate had brought Flynn Callahan to those train tracks tonight. Despite her caution, she felt something she hadn't felt since Robert's death. Hope. Morning brought Sarah to wakefulness with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Sunlight streamed through curtained windows, illuminating a simply furnished but clean bedroom. The events of the previous night came rushing back: the stranger on horseback, the offer of shelter, the quiet ranch house. She rose quickly, finding her children still sound asleep in the adjoining room. They looked peaceful, their faces relaxed in a way she hadn't seen in months. Part of her wanted to let them sleep, to allow them this respite, but her pride insisted they not overstay their welcome. They needed to establish their worth, and quickly. Dressing hastily in her worn but clean dress, Sarah made her way downstairs, following the scent of coffee and wood smoke. She found Flynn Callahan in the kitchen, his tall frame bent over the stove as he transferred bacon from a cast iron skillet to a platter. "Good morning," she said, her voice betraying her nervousness. Flynn turned, seemingly unsurprised by her presence. "Mrs. Miller," he nodded. "Coffee's hot if you'd like some. Breakfast will be ready shortly." "I should have been up earlier to help," Sarah said, moving toward the stove. "Please let me finish that." Flynn stepped aside, relinquishing the spatula with a hint of a smile. "Not used to having a woman around the house. Usually just fend for myself unless Mrs. Peabody's here." Sarah took over the cooking, quickly assessing what was available and adding scrambled eggs to the breakfast. "Your kindness last night. I don't know how to thank you properly." "No thanks needed," Flynn replied, pouring her a cup of coffee and setting it where she could reach it. "Just did what anyone should have done." "Not everyone would," Sarah said quietly, thinking of the townspeople who had looked away as she and her children were evicted. "Most wouldn't." A noise from the stairs interrupted their conversation as Emma appeared, her hair tousled from sleep but her eyes wide with curiosity. Thomas followed close behind, while Sarah had left little Abigail still sleeping. "Mama," Emma called uncertainly, stopping at the sight of the strange man. "It's all right, Emma," Sarah assured her. "This is Mr. Callahan. He's letting us stay in his home for a while." She turned to Flynn. "These are my older two, Emma and Thomas. Abigail is still sleeping." Flynn approached the children slowly, crouching down to meet them at eye level. "Mighty pleased to meet you both. You can call me Flynn if you like. Are you hungry? Your mama's fixing up a fine breakfast." Thomas nodded eagerly, his usual shyness forgotten at the mention of food, while Emma remained cautious, moving to stand beside her mother. "It's all right," Sarah whispered to her. "He's a good man." As they ate breakfast, Sarah observed Flynn with her children. He was patient, answering Thomas's sudden barrage of questions about the ranch and its animals with good humor. Even Emma gradually warmed to him, especially when he mentioned that he had a gentle mare that might be suitable for children to ride. "Can we, Mama?" Thomas asked excitedly. "Can we ride a horse? Perhaps if Mr. Callahan has time to teach you properly," Sarah said, casting a questioning glance at Flynn. "Got nothing but time today," Flynn replied. "Was planning to mend some fences on the north pasture, but that can wait. Best the young ones get their bearings here first." After breakfast, while Flynn showed the children around the ranch yard, Sarah took the opportunity to explore the house. It was larger than it had appeared in the darkness: 6 rooms downstairs, including a spacious kitchen, dining room, sitting room, and what appeared to be Flynn's office. Upstairs were 4 bedrooms and a small washroom with a copper tub. Everything was functional rather than fancy, but there were touches that surprised her: good books on shelves, a piano in the corner of the sitting room, and quality furniture that spoke of care rather than ostentation. She was examining a framed photograph of a younger Flynn with an older couple, his parents, she assumed when he returned with the children. "Your home is lovely," Sarah said, replacing the photograph carefully. "You've been very generous with your space." Flynn shrugged. "Built it thinking there'd be more than just me living in it someday. Seems a waste otherwise." The implication hung in the air that he had built this house for a family he didn't yet have. Sarah felt a sudden pang of intrusion. "We won't impose for long," she assured him quickly. "Once I can find work in town, no rush," Flynn interrupted gently. "Winter's coming on fast and jobs are scarce until spring. Besides," he added with a glance at the children, "ranch could use some life in it." That afternoon, true to his word, Flynn introduced Thomas and Emma to a gentle chestnut mare named Penny. Sarah watched from the corral fence, little Abigail on her hip, as Flynn patiently showed her older children how to approach the horse, how to offer an apple from a flat palm, how to stroke her neck. "Horses can tell when you're scared," he explained to Emma, who hung back slightly. "They're looking to you to know if they should be scared too." "What if she steps on me?" Emma asked warily. "She's careful," Flynn assured her. "Here, give me your hand." Sarah held her breath as Flynn gently took Emma's small hand in his and guided it to Penny's soft muzzle. The look of wonder that bloomed on her daughter's face as the horse nuzzled her palm made Sarah's heart constrict. It had been so long since she'd seen that expression on Emma's face, too long since any of her children had experienced simple joy. "Look, Mama." Thomas called excitedly from where Flynn had lifted him onto Penny's back. "I'm riding." Flynn kept a secure hold on both horse and boy as he led them in a slow circle, Thomas beaming with pride. Even Emma eventually took a turn, her initial fear transforming into cautious delight. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ranch yard, Sarah found herself standing beside Flynn as they watched the children playing with a litter of kittens they'd discovered in the barn. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's been a difficult time for them, for all of us." Flynn nodded, his eyes still on the children. "Mind if I ask what happened to their father?" Sarah swallowed hard. It still hurt to talk about. "Pneumonia, last winter. Robert was a carpenter, a good one. We had a nice little home in Denver, but after he died, I couldn't keep up with the payments. We moved to Laramie because I had heard there was work for seamstresses, but..." She trailed off. The rest was obvious. "I'm sorry," Flynn said simply. "Losing someone you love leaves a hole nothing else can fill." Something in his tone made Sarah look up at him, really look at him for the first time. His profile was strong, his expression thoughtful. There was a sadness in him, she realized, a loneliness that resonated with her own. "You've lost someone too," she said, a statement rather than a question. Flynn nodded, his gaze distant. "My parents 5 years back. Influenza took them both within days of each other. Had a sweetheart once too, but she decided Wyoming winters weren't to her liking, moved back east." "I'm sorry," Sarah echoed his earlier sentiment. Flynn shrugged, then seemed to shake off the melancholy. "Life goes on. Has to." He straightened, calling to the children. "Time to wash up for supper, you three. Can't have Mrs. Miller thinking I'm running a wild camp here." That evening, after the children were bathed and in bed, Sarah found herself once again sitting across from Flynn at the kitchen table. This time, rather than coffee, he had poured them each a small glass of whiskey. "For medicinal purposes," he said with a wink when she hesitated. "Keeps the chill away." Sarah took a small sip, feeling the warm burn down her throat. "I want to establish some terms," she said, gathering her courage, "for our stay here." Flynn raised an eyebrow but nodded for her to continue. "I'll earn our keep," she stated firmly. "Cooking, cleaning, mending, whatever's needed, and I'll need to find some work I can do to save money for when we move on." "Fair enough," Flynn agreed, "though there's plenty of work right here if you're of a mind to do it. Could use help with the accounts, for one. Never was good with figures." "You'd trust me with your accounts?" Sarah asked, surprised. Flynn shrugged. "You don't strike me as the type to steal, Mrs. Miller." "Sarah," she corrected him impulsively. "If we're to be working together, you might as well use my given name." A slow smile spread across Flynn's face. "Sarah, then," he raised his glass slightly, "to new beginnings." Sarah touched her glass to his, a tentative smile forming on her own lips. to new beginnings. As October gave way to November, a routine began to establish itself at the Callahan ranch. Sarah rose early each morning to prepare breakfast before Flynn headed out to work with his small crew of ranch hands. The children quickly adapted to ranch life, even little Abigail toddling after the barn cats and chickens with delighted squeals. Emma and Thomas began lessons at the kitchen table each morning, Sarah determined that their education not suffer despite their circumstances. Flynn had surprised her by producing a box of school books from the attic, explaining that they had belonged to his mother, who had been a schoolteacher before marrying his father. She always hoped for grandchildren to pass these on to, he'd said, a hint of melancholy in his voice as he'd handed over the well-preserved volumes. In the afternoons, while Abigail napped, Sarah worked on the ranch accounts as promised. She discovered that Flynn had been understating his difficulty with bookkeeping. The ledgers were in disarray, with entries missing and figures that didn't add up. It was oddly satisfying work, bringing order to the chaos, and Sarah found herself looking forward to the quiet hours at his desk by the window. Flynn, for his part, included Thomas in simple ranch chores whenever possible, teaching the boy to collect eggs and feed the chickens. He even carved a small wooden rake so Thomas could help in the barn, a gesture that had brought tears to Sarah's eyes when her son had proudly shown it to her. "He's good with them," Mrs. Peabody observed one afternoon as she and Sarah worked side by side in the kitchen, preparing stew for supper. The older woman came 3 times a week now, seemingly delighted to have another woman to talk to. "Never seen Flynn take to anyone the way he has to your little ones." "He's been very kind," Sarah agreed, carefully neutral. Mrs. Peabody shot her a knowing look. "Kind, yes, but it's more than that. Man's been rattling around this big house alone too long, needs a family." She paused in her vegetable chopping. "And if you don't mind my saying so, you and your children need someone like him." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "We're just temporary guests, Mrs. Peabody." "Once spring comes, spring's a long ways off," the older woman interrupted with a smile. "And a lot can happen between now and then." That evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Sarah sat on the porch swing wrapped in a thick blanket Flynn had insisted she take. The children were asleep, the house quiet except for the occasional creak of timber settling. The sound of boots on the porch steps announced Flynn's arrival. He'd gone to check on a pregnant mare in the barn after supper, promising to join Sarah afterward. "She doing all right?" Sarah asked as he settled beside her on the swing. "Just fine," Flynn confirmed. "First foal, so she's a bit restless, but that's normal." He glanced at the snow falling gently around them. "First snow's always the prettiest," Sarah nodded, drawing the blanket closer. "The children will be excited in the morning." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the snowflakes dance in the lantern light. "Can I ask you something, Sarah?" Flynn's voice was quiet in the stillness. "Of course. What were your plans before I found you by those tracks?" "Where were you heading?" Sarah sighed, the memory of her desperation still raw. "I didn't have plans, not really, just away. I'd heard there were jobs in Cheyenne maybe, or further west in the mining towns, anywhere I could find work and shelter for my children." She paused. "I was running on hope more than sense, I suppose." Flynn's hand found hers on the swing between them, his calloused fingers warm against her cold ones. "Sometimes hope's all we've got." Sarah looked down at their joined hands but didn't pull away. Flynn, the sound of Abigail crying from inside interrupted whatever she might have said. Sarah stood quickly, slipping her hand from his. "I should go to her." Flynn nodded, though something like disappointment flickered in his eyes. "Go on, I'll bank the fires for the night." As Sarah tended to Abigail, rocking her back to sleep, she found herself thinking about the feeling of Flynn's hand on hers, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. It both thrilled and terrified her. She wasn't ready for such feelings, wasn't sure she ever would be again. Robert had been her first and only love, her partner since she was 18. The idea of opening her heart again seemed impossible, and yet. By the time the first heavy snows of December had blanketed the ranch, Sarah had to admit to herself that life at the Callahan place had begun to feel remarkably like home. The children had blossomed, Thomas following Flynn around like a devoted shadow, Emma losing the pinched, worried look that had haunted her young face for so long, and Abigail growing chubbier and more talkative by the day. As for Sarah herself, she had gained back the weight she'd lost during their hardest times, and sometimes caught glimpses of a woman she barely recognized in the mirror, cheeks flushed with color, eyes bright, hair glossy again. "You're looking well," Flynn commented one evening as they sat by the fire after the children were in bed. It had become their routine, these quiet hours together, sometimes talking, sometimes simply sharing the peaceful silence. Sarah smiled, setting aside her mending. "I feel well. Better than I have in a very long time." Flynn's eyes held hers for a moment longer than usual. "I'm glad." Something in his tone made her heart beat faster. They had grown comfortable with each other over the weeks, but there remained an unspoken boundary between them, a careful distance they both maintained despite their growing closeness. "Flynn," Sarah began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about Christmas. It's only 2 weeks away, and the children." She trailed off, uncertain how to continue. "They should have a proper Christmas," Flynn finished for her, "with a tree and presents and all the trimmings." Sarah nodded. "I've managed to put aside a little from the mending I've done for Mrs. Peabody and some of the hands, but Sarah," Flynn interrupted gently, "this is your home now for as long as you want it to be, and Christmas is as much for me as for the children. Let me do this." "You've already done so much," Sarah protested. Flynn leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Do you know what this house was like before you and the children came? Quiet, empty, just a place to sleep and eat." He gestured around them. "Now it's alive. There's laughter and stories and even squabbles sometimes. It's a home again." He reached for her hand. "You've given me that gift. Let me give you Christmas." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "All right," she whispered, "but I insist on making the Christmas dinner and baking the pies." Flynn's smile warmed her from the inside out. Wouldn't have it any other way. The next day, Flynn rode into town with a list Sarah had helped him compile: fabric for new clothes for the children, toys, books, and all the ingredients for a proper Christmas feast. Sarah spent the day cleaning the house from top to bottom with Mrs. Peabody's help, while the children crafted simple decorations from pine cones and scraps of colored paper. When Flynn returned late that afternoon, his saddlebags and a pack horse laden with parcels, the excitement in the house was palpable. He refused to let anyone see what he'd brought, secreting everything away in his office with a mysterious smile. "You'll have to wait until Christmas morning," he told the disappointed children. "That's the rule." But he did produce one bundle immediately, a small pine tree he'd cut on the way home. Together, they set it up in the corner of the sitting room, and the children hung their handmade decorations on its branches while Flynn and Sarah watched, mugs of hot cider in hand. "I haven't seen them this happy in so long," Sarah murmured, watching as Thomas carefully placed a paper star at the very top, perched precariously on a chair with Flynn spotting him. "Children bounce back," Flynn replied. "They're resilient that way. And adults." Sarah asked before she could stop herself. Flynn's gaze was steady on hers. "Some more than others. Takes courage to start again." "Is that what we're doing?" Sarah asked softly, "starting again?" Before Flynn could answer, Emma called for their attention to see the completed tree, and the moment passed. But later, as Sarah lay in bed, she found herself returning to that unfinished conversation, wondering what Flynn might have said had they not been interrupted. Christmas Eve arrived with a fresh blanket of snow and a sense of anticipation that filled the house. Sarah spent the morning baking pies and cookies and fresh bread that filled the house with mouth-watering aromas. Flynn and Thomas ventured out to check on the livestock, returning rosy-cheeked and stamping snow from their boots. "Penny's looking mighty fine," Thomas announced proudly as he shed his coat. Flynn had been teaching him to groom the gentle mare, a responsibility the boy took very seriously. "That's because you take such good care of her," Flynn praised, ruffling the boy's hair. Sarah watched the easy affection between them with a mixture of joy and a strange, bittersweet ache. Thomas needed a father figure, and Flynn had stepped into that role so naturally. But where did that leave her? What was she to Flynn? A charity case, a housekeeper. A friend that evening, after a simple supper, Flynn produced a surprise, a small box of ornaments made of blown glass. "These were my mother's," he explained as he carefully opened the box. "Been in the attic since she passed. Thought this year they should see the light again." Together, they added the delicate ornaments to the tree, transforming it from charming to magical. When they finished, Flynn lit candles and placed them carefully on the tree while Sarah watched nervously, ready with a bucket of water just in case. "My father always said Christmas Eve was for stories," Flynn said once they were all settled by the fire, the tree glowing in the corner. "Anyone know a good Christmas tale?" Emma, who had become quite the reader thanks to Sarah's daily lessons, immediately volunteered to read from a book of Christmas stories Flynn had brought down from the attic. Her clear young voice filled the room as she read about the birth of Jesus in a humble manger. When she finished, Thomas begged Flynn for a cowboy Christmas story, and Flynn obliged with a tale about a lonely cowhand who found a lost calf on Christmas Eve and returned it to its mother, only to discover he'd wandered onto a ranch where a Christmas feast was underway. The rancher, grateful for the cowhand's kindness, invited him to join the celebration, and the cowhand ended up staying on as the ranch foreman. And he was never lonely again, Flynn concluded, his eyes meeting Sarah's over the children's heads. "I like that story," Thomas declared sleepily. "It has a happy ending." "The best stories usually do," Flynn agreed. After the children were tucked into bed with promises that Santa Claus would indeed find them even on a remote Wyoming ranch, Sarah and Flynn returned to the sitting room. Flynn poured them each a small glass of brandy and raised his in a toast. "To Christmas," he said, "and to finding what you didn't know you were looking for." Sarah clinked her glass against his, her heart racing at the intensity in his eyes. "Flynn, I have something for you," he interrupted, setting down his glass and reaching into his pocket. "Wanted to give it to you tonight, just between us." He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon. Sarah took it with trembling hands. "You didn't need to get me anything," she protested. "Wanted to," Flynn said simply. "Go on, open it." Sarah carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a small wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, was a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. "Oh, Flynn," she breathed, lifting it carefully. "It's beautiful. Open it," he urged softly. Inside the locket was a tiny photograph of her 3 children, their faces smiling up at her. Sarah felt tears well in her eyes. "How did you?" "Mrs. Peabody's son is the photographer in town," Flynn explained. "I had him come out one day when you were busy with the accounts. The children kept the secret admirably well." Sarah closed the locket gently, cradling it in her palm. "I don't know what to say." Flynn took the necklace from her hand and moved behind her. "You don't need to say anything," he said as he fastened it around her neck, his fingers warm against her skin. "Just wanted you to have something to remind you that even in the darkest times, there's still beauty in the world." Sarah turned to face him, the locket warm against her throat. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not just for this, but for everything, for finding us that night, for bringing us here, for—" She hesitated, then continued, "for showing me that life can begin again, even when you think it's over." Flynn's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle. "Sarah," he said, his voice low, "I need to tell you something." Sarah held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. "That night I found you by the tracks," Flynn continued. "I almost didn't ride that way. Had no reason to, usually take the south path back from town. Something just pulled me there." His thumb brushed softly across her cheekbone. "I've come to believe it wasn't chance at all." "What was it then?" Sarah asked, barely above a whisper. "Fate, maybe," Flynn replied, "or Providence. All I know is that from the moment I saw you standing there, protecting your children, I felt like I'd found something I didn't even know I was missing." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I was so lost," she admitted, "so afraid." "You're not lost anymore," Flynn said firmly. "And you don't need to be afraid, not while I'm here." Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Flynn lowered his head until his lips met hers in a kiss so gentle it was barely there. Sarah closed her eyes, letting herself feel the tenderness of his touch, the warmth of his presence. When he pulled back, his eyes searched hers for any sign of regret or discomfort. Finding none, a slow smile spread across his face. "Merry Christmas, Sarah," he whispered. "Merry Christmas, Flynn," she replied, and this time it was she who leaned forward to bring their lips together again. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear, the sun glinting off the snow-covered landscape surrounding the ranch. Sarah woke early, her hand automatically going to the locket at her throat, a reminder that last night had not been a dream. Flynn had kissed her, and she had kissed him back, and somehow the world felt different today, brighter, full of possibilities she had thought forever closed to her. The patter of small feet in the hallway announced the children's awakening, and Sarah rose quickly to dress. Christmas morning with young children waited for no one, especially when there were presents involved. She found Flynn already in the kitchen, stoking the fire and setting water to boil for coffee. He looked up as she entered, a smile spreading across his face that made her heart skip. "Merry Christmas," he said, his voice warm with affection. "Merry Christmas," she replied, suddenly shy in the light of day. Before either could say more, the children burst into the kitchen, their excitement palpable. "Is it time for presents?" Thomas asked, practically bouncing with anticipation. "Breakfast first," Sarah insisted, though she couldn't help smiling at their eagerness. "Then presents." Breakfast was a hasty affair, with the children too excited to eat much. As soon as the dishes were cleared, Flynn led them all to the sitting room, where presents had appeared beneath the tree overnight, cloth-wrapped packages of various sizes, each with a child's name carefully written on a paper tag. "Santa came," Abigail exclaimed, clapping her hands in delight. "He surely did," Flynn agreed, kneeling beside the tree. "Let's see what he brought for you all." The next hour was filled with exclamations of joy as the children unwrapped their gifts. For Emma, there was a beautiful doll with a porcelain face and real hair, along with a set of watercolor paints and paper. Thomas received a carved wooden train, a small tool set sized for his hands, and a picture book about cowboys. Little Abigail squealed over a stuffed bear, a colorful ball, and a set of wooden blocks. But the greatest surprise came when Flynn brought out 3 final packages from behind the sofa: new clothes for each child, sewn from the fabric he had purchased in town. There were warm winter dresses for the girls and a proper pair of trousers and a shirt for Thomas, all in cheerful colors. "Mr. Flynn," Emma said, holding her new dress against herself, "did Santa make these too?" Flynn chuckled. "Santa had some help from Mrs. Peabody on those. She's quite handy with a needle." Sarah watched, her heart full, as her children admired their gifts. The simple joy on their faces was something she had feared she might never see again during their darkest days. She was so absorbed in their happiness that she almost missed Flynn moving to her side with another package in his hands. "One more," he said quietly, offering it to her. "Flynn, the locket was more than enough," Sarah protested. "This one's different," he insisted. "Open it." Curious, Sarah unwrapped the package to find a leather-bound book. Opening it, she discovered it was blank inside, the pages creamy and inviting. "It's a journal," Flynn explained. "Thought you might like to write down your thoughts or stories for the children or plans for the future." "Whatever you like." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched Sarah deeply. "It's perfect," she said, running her fingers over the soft leather cover. "Thank you." "There's something else," Flynn added, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "Something I want to ask you, but not today. After New Year's, perhaps, when things are quieter." Sarah looked up at him, a question in her eyes, but Flynn simply smiled and squeezed her hand before turning his attention back to the children and their new toys. The rest of Christmas Day passed in a blur of activity: a grand dinner with all the trimmings, games by the fire, and finally, as evening fell, carols sung around the piano that Flynn, to everyone's surprise, played quite skillfully. "My mother insisted on lessons," he explained when Sarah expressed her astonishment. "Said no child of hers would grow up without music." As she tucked the children into bed that night, each clutching their favorite new gift, Sarah felt a contentment she had not experienced in a very long time. "Mama," Emma said sleepily as Sarah kissed her forehead, "can we stay here forever?" The question caught Sarah off guard. "Do you want to?" she asked carefully. Emma nodded. "Thomas does too. We talked about it. We like it here with Mr. Flynn. He makes you smile again." Sarah smoothed her daughter's hair, buying time to compose herself. "We'll see, sweetheart. For now, let's just enjoy being here, all right?" "All right," Emma agreed, her eyes already closing, "but I hope we stay." Downstairs, Flynn was waiting by the fire, a cup of tea prepared just the way Sarah liked it. She accepted it gratefully, settling beside him on the sofa. "The children are overjoyed," she told him. "I don't know how to thank you for making this Christmas so special for them." "Seeing their faces was thanks enough," Flynn replied. "Haven't enjoyed a Christmas like this since my parents were alive." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire dance in the hearth. "Emma asked if we could stay here forever," Sarah said finally, her eyes on the flames rather than on Flynn's face. "And what did you tell her?" Flynn's voice was carefully neutral. "That we'd see." Sarah took a deep breath, finally turning to look at him. "Flynn, what is this? Between us, I mean." "Last night you kissed me and I kissed you back, but I need to know what you're thinking, what you want." Flynn set his cup aside and took both her hands in his. "What I want," he said slowly, "is for you and the children to stay. Not as my housekeeper or as charity cases, but because this is where you belong, with me." "Are you saying?" "I'm saying I care for you, Sarah, more than I thought possible after such a short time, and I care for your children as if they were my own." Flynn's eyes held hers steadily. "I wasn't planning to have this conversation until after the new year, but since you've asked, I want us to be a family, a real one." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. "Flynn, you don't need to answer now," he assured her quickly. "I know it's a lot to take in and you might not be ready. I understand that, but I wanted you to know where I stand, what I hope for." Sarah looked down at their joined hands, her mind whirling with emotions. Part of her wanted to accept immediately, to throw caution to the wind and embrace this second chance at happiness. But another part held back, cautious and afraid. "I need time," she said finally. "Not because I don't care for you, I do, more than I can say, but this isn't just about me. It's about Emma and Thomas and Abigail too. Their lives have been turned upside down so many times already, I need to be sure." Flynn nodded, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes on his face. "Of course, take all the time you need, I'm not going anywhere." As the week between Christmas and New Year's passed, Sarah found herself watching Flynn with new eyes, seeing not just his kindness to her and her children, but the man himself. The way he ran his ranch with quiet competence, firm but fair with his hands. The patience he showed when teaching Thomas to whittle or Emma to play simple tunes on the piano. The tenderness in his eyes when he held Abigail on his lap, reading her a story before bedtime. And she saw how he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, with a mixture of hope and longing that made her heart ache in the best possible way. They hadn't kissed again since Christmas Eve, both seemingly content to let this new awareness between them develop slowly. But there were moments, a brush of hands as they passed dishes at the table, a shared smile across the room, a lingering touch on her shoulder as he passed her chair that spoke volumes about his feelings. New Year's Eve arrived cold and clear, the stars brilliant in the Wyoming sky. Flynn had invited his ranch hands and their families to the house for a modest celebration, and Sarah spent the day cooking alongside Mrs. Peabody, preparing a feast to welcome in 1879. The evening was filled with music, laughter, and stories as the small community gathered in the warmth of Flynn's home. Sarah, wearing her best dress freshly pressed and adorned with a new ribbon Flynn had brought her from town, moved among the guests, filling plates and cups, accepting compliments on her cooking and her children with quiet grace. As midnight approached, Flynn found her in the kitchen where she was preparing a tray of coffee for the guests. "Almost the new year," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Any resolutions?" Sarah smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "Just one. To make sure my children are happy and safe." They seem to be both of those things already, Flynn observed. Might need a new resolution. Perhaps, Sarah agreed. What about you? Any resolutions for 1879? Flynn stepped closer, taking the coffee pot from her hands and setting it back on the stove. Just one, he echoed her words. To convince a certain stubborn woman that she and her children belong right here with me. Sarah felt her cheeks flush. Flynn, I know, he interrupted gently. You need time, but it's almost a new year, Sarah, and I don't want to begin it with things unsaid between us. He took her hands in his. I love you. I think I started falling in love with you that very first night when you stood ready to protect your children with nothing but a small knife and your courage. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. I loved Robert, she whispered. For so long he was my whole world. I know, Flynn said softly, and I would never ask you to forget him or stop loving him. He gave you your children, he was your first love, that's a sacred thing. But, Sarah prompted, hearing the unspoken word in his tone. But hearts are remarkable things, Flynn continued. They have room for more than one love, different maybe, but no less real. In the other room, the guests began to count down to midnight. 10, 9, 8, I'm afraid, Sarah admitted. Afraid to trust this feeling, afraid to risk loving again. 7, 6, 5, I'm afraid too, Flynn confessed. Afraid you'll say no, afraid you'll leave when spring comes. 4, 3, 2, I don't want to leave, Sarah whispered, the truth finally spoken aloud. I want to stay. With you, 1. Happy New Year. As cheers erupted from the sitting room, Flynn pulled Sarah gently into his arms. Then stay, he murmured against her hair. Stay and be my wife. Let me be a father to your children. Let us be a family. Sarah looked up at him, tears shining in her eyes. Yes, she said simply, yes to all of it. Flynn's face lit with a joy so pure it took her breath away. Then he was kissing her, his lips warm and tender against hers, his arms strong around her waist. Sarah wound her arms around his neck, returning his kiss with all the emotion she'd been holding back. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. Happy New Year, Sarah. Happy New Year, Flynn, she replied, her heart too full for more words. A small sound from the doorway made them both turn. Emma stood there, her eyes wide, Thomas just behind her. Mama, Emma said uncertainly. Are you and Mr. Flynn going to get married? Sarah looked up at Flynn, who nodded encouragingly. Yes, sweetheart, she answered, holding out her hand to her children. If that's all right with you and Thomas and Abigail, Emma broke into a radiant smile. It's all right with me, she declared, running forward to hug them both. Thomas too, right, Thomas? Thomas nodded vigorously. Does this mean Mr. Flynn will be our new pa? He asked. Flynn crouched down to the boy's level. If you'd like me to be, he said seriously. I'd be honored to be your pa, but I know your real father loved you very much, and I'd never try to replace him in your hearts. Thomas considered this solemnly. I think Pa would be glad Mama's not sad anymore, he said finally, and that we have a home again. Flynn's eyes glistened suspiciously. I think you're right, son, he said, his voice a little rough. Your pa sounds like he was a fine man. He was, Sarah confirmed, her own eyes wet, and he would be grateful, knowing his children are loved and cared for. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and well wishes as news of their engagement spread among the guests. Mrs. Peabody was particularly pleased, declaring that she'd known all along they were meant for each other. Later, after the guests had departed and the children were asleep, Sarah and Flynn stood on the porch, watching the stars in the clear January sky. When shall we be married? Flynn asked, his arm around her waist. Soon, Sarah replied. Before spring planting keeps you too busy. Perhaps February, Flynn nodded. February it is, nothing fancy unless you want it to be. Just family and close friends, Sarah decided. That's all we need. Flynn turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. I want you to know something, Sarah. I'll never forget that night I found you and the children by the tracks. It was the luckiest night of my life, though I reckon it was one of your darkest. It was both, Sarah said softly. The end of one chapter and the beginning of another, though I couldn't see it then. I promise you this, Flynn continued, his voice solemn in the quiet night. You'll never have to worry about shelter or food or safety again, not while I'm alive to provide them. And your children will always have a father who loves them as his own. Sarah reached up to touch his face, her fingertips tracing the line of his jaw. "And I promise you'll never be lonely in this big house again. It will be filled with love and laughter and perhaps, someday, more children." Flynn's eyes widened slightly. "You'd want more," Sarah smiled. "Perhaps, would you?" "With you," Flynn pulled her closer. "I'd want whatever makes you happy, 1 more or 5 more or none at all, as long as we're together." As February dawned, the ranch was a flurry of activity in preparation for the wedding. Mrs. Peabody and several women from neighboring ranches helped Sarah sew a new dress, not white, for she was a widow, but a soft blue that brought out the color of her eyes. Emma was beside herself with excitement at the prospect of being a flower girl, while Thomas took his role as ring-bearer with grave seriousness. Flynn, for his part, seemed to walk about in a happy daze, stopping work at odd moments to gaze at the house as if seeing it anew. He made improvements with fresh energy, fixing the loose board on the porch, repainting the sitting room, replacing the worn carpet in what would soon be their shared bedroom. The wedding day itself arrived with unexpected mildness, the February sun warming the air enough that they could hold the ceremony in the garden rather than crowding everyone into the house. The local minister rode out from town, and neighbors from miles around gathered to witness the union. Sarah, standing before the simple arch Flynn had constructed and decorated with winter greenery, felt a sense of rightness settle over her as she spoke her vows. This was not the life she had planned, not the path she had expected to walk, but it was good and true and right. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, beaming at them both. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Callahan." Flynn's kiss was tender and reverent, a promise sealed before all their friends and neighbors. When they turned to face the small crowd, Sarah was surprised to find herself laughing through happy tears as cheers erupted around them. Emma and Thomas rushed forward to hug them both, and Flynn scooped up little Abigail, who had been watching the proceedings with solemn interest from Mrs. Peabody's arms. "We're a family now," Flynn told the children, his voice thick with emotion. "All of us together." The celebration continued through the afternoon and into the evening with food and music and dancing in the barn, which had been cleared and decorated for the occasion. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow over the festivities. Sarah found a quiet moment to slip away to the porch, needing a brief respite from the joyful chaos. She stood looking out at the land that was now truly her home, at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Happy?" Flynn's voice came from behind her as he joined her on the porch, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. "More than I ever thought possible again," Sarah admitted, leaning into his embrace. "When Robert died, I thought that was the end of happiness for me. I was just trying to survive, to keep the children alive and safe." She turned in his arms to face him. "I never imagined I could feel this way again with someone new." Flynn brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Life's full of unexpected turns," he said. "Some terrible, some wonderful. Finding you that night, that was the most wonderful turn my life could have taken." "Mine too," Sarah whispered, standing on tiptoe to kiss him, "though I didn't know it then, Mrs. Callahan," Flynn murmured against her lips. "I believe we're neglecting our guests." Sarah smiled at her new name. "Just a moment longer," she said, resting her head against his chest. "I want to remember this moment exactly as it is." Flynn tightened his arms around her, and together they stood in the growing darkness, at the threshold of their shared future. Spring came early that year, the snow melting to reveal tender green shoots pushing through the soil. The ranch hummed with new life, a foal born to Penny, chickens hatching fluffy chicks and wildflowers blooming across the prairie. Sarah, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of tea in her hands, watched as Flynn helped Thomas plant a small vegetable garden behind the house. The boy had taken to ranch life with enthusiasm, soaking up everything Flynn taught him like a sponge. Emma, too, had blossomed, her natural intelligence nurtured by both Sarah's continued lessons and Flynn's practical knowledge. Even little Abigail, now almost 4, had grown more confident and adventurous under Flynn's watchful eye, and Sarah herself had found a contentment she had never expected to feel again. Marriage to Flynn was different from her first marriage, not better or worse, just different. Where Robert had been serious and steady, Flynn had an unexpected playfulness beneath his capable exterior. He made her laugh, challenged her thinking, and treated her as a full partner in all decisions regarding the ranch and family. Their nights together were tender and passionate, a mutual discovery that had left Sarah breathless with joy. Flynn was a considerate lover, patient and attentive, and in his arms, Sarah had rediscovered parts of herself she thought had died with Robert. A slight wave of nausea interrupted her thoughts, and Sarah set down her tea with a small smile. She hadn't told Flynn yet, wanting to be certain before sharing the news, but she was fairly sure she was carrying his child. Their child. The thought filled her with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She was older now than when she'd had Abigail, and childbirth was always a risk, especially in remote areas like theirs. But the town had a proper doctor now, and Flynn would insist on bringing him out to the ranch when her time came. Everything would be fine. Better than fine. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to the road leading to the ranch. A rider was approaching, and as he drew closer, Sarah recognized him as Jimmy Porter, the telegraph operator from town. Setting aside her tea, Sarah stepped onto the porch just as Flynn straightened from his gardening to greet the visitor. "Mr. Callahan," Jimmy called as he dismounted. "Got a telegram for you. Seemed important, so I rode out instead of waiting for your next trip to town." Flynn took the folded paper with a nod of thanks and a coin for Jimmy's trouble. Sarah watched as he read it, his expression changing from curiosity to shock. "Flynn." She called, descending the porch steps. "What is it?" Flynn looked up, his face pale beneath his tan. "It's from a lawyer in Denver," he said, his voice strained. "My cousin Edward is dead, influenza." Sarah reached his side, placing a hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry," she said. Though she knew Flynn had never been close to his cousin, his only living relative, Flynn shook his head, still staring at the telegram. "There's more. Edward had a son, a boy of 10. His mother died years ago, and there's no one else, the lawyer says." He cleared his throat. "The lawyer says the boy is my responsibility now as next of kin." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she took in the implications. Another child, a grieving boy they'd never met, suddenly thrust into their lives. "What's his name?" she asked quietly. "Samuel," Flynn replied. "Samuel Callahan." Sarah took a deep breath, then squeezed Flynn's arm gently. "Then we'll need to prepare a room for Samuel," she said with calm determination. "When will he arrive?" Flynn looked at her, his expression softening from shock to gratitude. "The lawyer suggests I come to Denver to collect him and settle Edward's affairs. It would mean leaving for a week, maybe 2. Sarah nodded. "You should go as soon as possible. The poor boy shouldn't be alone any longer than necessary." Flynn pulled her into a sudden, fierce embrace. "What did I do to deserve you?" he murmured against her hair. Sarah smiled against his shoulder. "You stopped by some train tracks one October night and said the kindest words I'd ever heard, 'Come home with me.'" That evening, after the children were asleep, Sarah and Flynn sat at the kitchen table, planning his journey to Denver and Samuel's arrival. "We'll put him in the room next to Thomas," Sarah decided. "They're close in age, might become friends." Flynn nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "Sarah, taking in this boy, it's asking a lot of you, of all of us." "He's family," Sarah said simply. "Just as Emma, Thomas, and Abigail are your family now." Flynn reached across the table to take her hand. "You're sure about this?" Sarah squeezed his fingers. "Flynn, when you found me and my children that night, we were strangers to you, yet you opened your home and your heart to us without hesitation. How could I do any less for your cousin's son?" Flynn's eyes softened with love. "You're an extraordinary woman, Sarah Callahan." Sarah took a deep breath, deciding this was the moment to share her own news. "There's something else you should know before you leave," she said, a small smile playing at her lips. "Our family is already growing in another way." Flynn's brow furrowed in confusion for a moment before understanding dawned in his eyes. "Sarah," he breathed, "are you saying?" She nodded, her smile widening. "I'm fairly certain. It's early yet, but all the signs are there." Flynn was around the table in an instant, kneeling beside her chair and gathering her into his arms. "A baby," he whispered, awe in his voice. Our baby. A new beginning, Sarah agreed, resting her forehead against his, for all of us. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood on the porch with Emma, Thomas, and Abigail, watching the approaching wagon with barely contained anticipation. Flynn had telegraphed from town that morning they were on their way home with Samuel. As the wagon drew closer, Sarah could make out Flynn's familiar figure holding the reins. Beside him sat a small, thin boy with dark hair, his posture rigid and his face unreadable even from a distance. Children, Sarah reminded her brood gently, remember what we talked about. Samuel has lost his father and is coming to live in a strange place with people he doesn't know. We need to be kind and patient, all right, 3 heads nodded solemnly. They had spent the past 2 weeks preparing cleaning the bedroom, making sure there were clothes that might fit a 10-year-old boy, and talking about how they could help their new family member feel welcome. The wagon rolled to a stop, and Flynn set the brake before jumping down and coming around to help Samuel descend. The boy moved with the careful precision of someone trying very hard to be brave, his small face composed but his eyes wary. Samuel, Flynn said as they approached the porch, this is my wife, Sarah, and her children, now my children too, Emma, Thomas, and Abigail. Sarah stepped forward, smiling warmly. Hello, Samuel, we're very glad you've come to live with us. Samuel looked up at her, then at the other children, before giving a small, formal nod. Thank you for having me, madam, he said, his voice quiet but clear. You must be tired and hungry after your journey, Sarah continued, gesturing toward the house. I've made chicken and dumplings for supper, and there's fresh apple pie for dessert. Something flickered in Samuel's eyes at the mention of pie, a brief spark of interest quickly suppressed, but Sarah had seen it, and it gave her hope. This grieving boy was still a child, after all, with a child's natural appetites and capacity for joy, however deeply buried at the moment. Thomas, she said, why don't you show Samuel to his room so he can wash up before supper? Thomas stepped forward eagerly. It's right next to mine, he told Samuel. I helped clean it up for you. There's a view of the horse pasture from the window. Samuel hesitated, looking up at Flynn as if for permission. Go ahead, Flynn encouraged gently. We'll bring your things up shortly. As the boys disappeared into the house, Emma leading Abigail after them, Sarah turned to Flynn with a questioning look. How was the journey? She asked softly. Flynn sighed, running a hand through his hair. Long, quiet, he barely speaks unless spoken to. The lawyer said he's been like that since Edward died, polite, obedient, but closed off, Sarah nodded, having expected as much. Grief takes different forms in children. He'll open up in his own time when he feels safe. Flynn pulled her into a quick embrace. I've missed you, he murmured against her hair. All of you. We've missed you too, Sarah replied, leaning into his strength for a moment before stepping back. Now let's get Samuel's things inside and then you can tell me everything over supper. The first few weeks with Samuel were challenging as they all adjusted to the new family dynamic. The boy was unfailingly polite but maintained a careful distance, watching the family interactions as if studying a foreign language. Sarah did her best to include him without pushing too hard, giving him space when he needed it, but making sure he knew he was wanted. Flynn, who had never met the boy before collecting him in Denver, worked to build a relationship from scratch, including Samuel in ranch chores, and teaching him to ride a gentle gelding they had acquired specifically for him. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, small changes began to appear. Samuel started to ask questions at the dinner table. He joined in when Thomas invited him to play. He began to laugh just occasionally at first, a startled sound as if he'd surprised himself, but gradually more freely. By summer, Samuel had become an integral part of the family. He and Thomas were inseparable, fishing in the creek, helping with chores, and occasionally getting into the kind of mischief that made Sarah shake her head even as she hid a smile. One evening in late July, as Sarah sat on the porch shelling peas, enjoying the slight swell of her growing belly, Samuel approached her hesitantly. Mrs. Callahan, he began, still formal despite Sarah's repeated invitations to call her by her first name. Yes, Samuel. Sarah replied, setting aside her work to give him her full attention. The boy twisted his hands together, his eyes on the porch floor. I was wondering, that is, if it's all right, could I maybe call you Aunt Sarah? Thomas calls you Ma, but that doesn't seem right for me since I remember my mother, but Mrs. Callahan feels too distant. Sarah felt her heart swell with emotion. I would be honored if you called me Aunt Sarah, she said warmly. Very honored indeed. Samuel's face brightened. And Mr. Callahan could be Uncle Flynn. I think he would like that very much, Sarah assured him. Samuel nodded, seemingly satisfied. Thank you, he said, then added with a small smile, Aunt Sarah. As he turned to go, Sarah called after him, Samuel, would you like to feel the baby move? It's quite active this evening. Samuel hesitated, then approached again, curiosity overcoming his usual reserve. Sarah took his hand and placed it gently on her rounded belly. After a moment, the baby gave a strong kick, and Samuel's eyes widened in wonder. That's amazing, he breathed. Is it a boy or a girl? We don't know yet, Sarah replied. We'll find out when it arrives sometime in November. Samuel considered this, his hand still on her belly. If it's a boy, he said seriously, Samuel is a good name. Sarah laughed, delighted by this rare glimpse of childish self-importance. We'll certainly consider it, she promised. November arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if the weather itself was conspiring to make Sarah's final weeks of pregnancy more comfortable. She moved more slowly now, her belly swollen and the baby active, especially at night when she was trying to sleep. Flynn hovered anxiously, insisting she rest more and delegating many of her usual tasks to Mrs. Peabody, who now came daily to help. The children, sensing the approaching change, alternated between excitement about the new baby and moments of insecurity, needing extra reassurance that they wouldn't be forgotten or loved less. Everything's ready, Flynn declared one evening after inspecting the cradle he had crafted himself, now positioned beside their bed. Dr. Jenkins has promised to come as soon as we send word, and Mrs. Peabody will stay with us once things begin. Sarah nodded, one hand rubbing her lower back. She had been experiencing dull aches all day, but nothing that suggested labor was imminent. We're as prepared as we can be, she agreed. That night, she woke just after midnight to a sharp pain and the unmistakable sensation of fluid soaking the bed. Flynn, she whispered, shaking his shoulder. It's time. The next hours passed in a blur of pain and determination. Flynn sent one of the ranch hands galloping for the doctor while Mrs. Peabody, summoned from her cottage on the property, took charge of the children and the practical arrangements. The labor progressed rapidly, more quickly than with any of Sarah's previous children. By dawn, as golden light began to filter through the bedroom curtains, she was fully dilated and ready to push. The doctor should be here by now, Flynn fretted, wiping her brow with a cool cloth. Babies come when they're ready, Mrs. Peabody replied calmly, examining Sarah. And this one's not waiting for anyone. You've done this before, Sarah. Your body knows what to do. Sarah nodded, gritting her teeth against another contraction. I can do this, she gasped. I need to push now. With Flynn supporting her back and Mrs. Peabody coaching from the foot of the bed, Sarah bore down with all her strength. 3 mighty pushes later, a lusty cry filled the room as their child entered the world. A girl, Mrs. Peabody announced joyfully, lifting the squalling infant for them to see. A beautiful, healthy girl. Flynn's face was wet with tears as he kissed Sarah's forehead, her cheeks, her lips. You did it, he whispered. You're amazing. Mrs. Peabody efficiently cleaned and wrapped the baby before placing her in Sarah's arms. She's a good size, the older woman observed. Strong lungs, too. Sarah looked down at her daughter, their daughter taking in the tuft of dark hair, the perfect tiny features, the surprising strength in the small hand that wrapped around her finger. She's perfect, Flynn said, his voice thick with emotion as he gently touched the baby's cheek. What shall we name her? They had discussed names but hadn't settled on anything definite, wanting to meet their child first. Now, looking at this new life they had created together, Sarah knew exactly the right name. Hope, she said softly. Her name is Hope. Flynn's eyes met hers, understanding immediately. Hope Callahan, he agreed. Perfect for a new beginning. Dr. Jenkins arrived an hour later, full of apologies. His horse had gone lame halfway to the ranch, forcing him to continue on foot. After examining both mother and baby, he pronounced them in excellent health. "You're a fortunate family," he told Flynn as he prepared to leave. "Mother and child both thriving, and just look at those other 4 children hovering by the door, eager to meet their new sister." Flynn turned to see Emma, Thomas, Abigail, and Samuel peering into the bedroom, their faces alight with curiosity and excitement. "Come in," he invited, gesturing them forward. "Come meet your sister, Hope." They approached the bed where Sarah reclined, the baby nestled in her arms. Emma, at 11 now and feeling very grown up, sat carefully on the edge of the bed and gazed in wonder at the infant. "She's so tiny," she marveled. "Was I ever that small?" "Even smaller," Sarah told her with a smile. "You were born early." Thomas and Samuel hung back slightly, interested but not quite sure what to make of this red-faced, wrinkly newcomer. Abigail, however, was enchanted, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's hand. "My sister," she declared possessively. "That's right," Flynn agreed, lifting her onto his lap so she could see better. "Your sister, all of yours." Samuel, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "She's not really my sister," he said, his voice uncertain. "Not by blood." Flynn looked at the boy steadily. "Family isn't just about blood, Samuel. It's about love and belonging. Hope is your sister because we're all family now, bound by choice and love rather than just blood. That's a powerful kind of family, one we build together." Samuel considered this, then nodded slowly. "I like that," he decided. "I've never had a sister before." "Well, now you have 3, Sarah told him with a warm smile, "and they're all lucky to have you as a brother." As spring blossomed across the Wyoming plains in 1880, the Callahan Ranch thrived under the care of its growing family. Sarah, fully recovered from Hope's birth, divided her time between caring for her infant daughter and managing the household with a newfound confidence. The older children attended the small school that had been established in the growing town, riding in together on their ponies each morning and returning full of stories and learning. Flynn had expanded their operations, adding more cattle and horses, hiring additional hands, and even purchasing the adjacent property when it came up for sale. The Callahan name was becoming known throughout the territory for quality livestock and fair dealing. On a warm May afternoon, as Sarah sat on a blanket in the garden watching Hope practice her newfound crawling skills, Flynn joined her, settling beside her with a contented sigh. "Ranch is doing well," he remarked, reaching out to redirect Hope as she headed determinedly toward a patch of mud. "Johnson offered top dollar for those yearlings." "That's wonderful," Sarah replied, leaning against his shoulder. "We should set some aside for the Children's Education Fund." Flynn nodded in agreement. "Been thinking about that." "Thomas shows real promise with the horses, might want to study veterinary medicine someday. And Emma's teacher says she has a gift for numbers. Samuel's writing has improved remarkably," Sarah added. "Mrs. Patterson thinks he might have a future as a journalist or author." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as Hope finally reached her goal, not the mud, but a colorful butterfly that had landed nearby. She sat back on her plump bottom, eyes wide with wonder as the insect fluttered around her head before flying away. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Flynn said finally, his tone casual but with an undercurrent of seriousness that made Sarah turn to look at him. "What is it?" she prompted. When he didn't continue immediately, Flynn took her hand, running his thumb over her wedding ring. "Do you ever regret it, saying yes when I asked you to stay to be my wife? Our life isn't easy sometimes, and it's certainly not what you might have had if things had been different." Sarah looked at him in surprise. "Regret it, Flynn? No, never." She squeezed his hand firmly. "Why would you ask such a thing?" Flynn shrugged, looking a bit embarrassed. "Just thinking about how we met, the circumstances. You were desperate, with 3 children to feed and nowhere to go. Maybe you felt you had no choice but to accept my offer." Sarah shook her head, amazed that after all this time, such a doubt could still linger in his mind. "Flynn Callahan, look at me," she commanded gently. When his eyes met hers, she continued, That night by the tracks, you offered us shelter and safety, and yes, I was desperate enough to accept it from a stranger. But when I agreed to marry you months later, it wasn't out of desperation or gratitude. It was because I had come to know you, your kindness, your integrity, your gentle heart. I married you because I loved you. I still do, more each day. Hope chose that moment to crawl into Flynn's lap, babbling happily and reaching for his beard. He caught her tiny hands in his, smiling despite himself. Besides, Sarah added, watching them with love, look what we've built together. 5 beautiful children, a prosperous ranch, a true home. How could I possibly regret that? Flynn leaned over to kiss her, a lingering touch full of tenderness. I don't deserve you, he murmured against her lips. Nonsense, Sarah replied with a smile. We deserve each other, a matched pair, as Mrs. Peabody likes to say. Hope, not appreciating being ignored, patted Flynn's face insistently until he turned his attention back to her, lifting her high in the air to her squealing delight. As Sarah watched them, a wave of contentment washed over her. 10 years ago, newly married to Robert, she could never have imagined the path her life would take: the heartbreak of widowhood, the desperate days by the train tracks, and then the unexpected second chance at love and family with Flynn. Life was unpredictable, sometimes cruel, sometimes amazingly generous. But sitting here in the garden of the home they had built together, surrounded by the evidence of their love, Sarah knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was exactly where she was meant to be. That evening, after the children were asleep, Sarah and Flynn sat on the porch swing, a tradition they had maintained through seasons and years. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the vast Wyoming sky, the air sweet with the scent of spring blossoms. Do you ever think about that night? Sarah asked softly, her head resting on Flynn's shoulder. The night you found us, Flynn's arm tightened around her. Often, he admitted. Sometimes I think about how close I came to not riding that way at all. One small decision and everything would be different, Sarah nodded, understanding completely. I think about the woman I was then, frightened, hopeless at the end of my rope, and now. She gestured toward the house behind them where their children slept safely. Now I can hardly remember that feeling. You were never hopeless, Flynn corrected gently. Desperate, yes, but not hopeless. It takes a special kind of courage to keep going when everything seems lost, to protect your children with nothing but your wits and determination. That's the woman I fell in love with, the one I'm still in love with. Sarah turned her face up to his, still moved by the tenderness in his expression even after all their time together. And I love you, Flynn Callahan, for seeing me at my worst and believing in me anyway. For giving us not just shelter, but a home. For being the kind of man who stops to help strangers by the train tracks. Flynn kissed her then, a kiss that held all the passion and promise of their first, all the comfort and familiarity of their shared years, and all the hope of their future together. As they broke apart, Flynn reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Got something for you, he said, a hint of shyness in his voice. Anniversary's not for a few months yet, but this seemed like the right moment. Sarah accepted the pouch curiously, loosening the drawstring to reveal a gold locket, larger and more ornate than the silver one he had given her that first Christmas. Open it, Flynn urged softly. Inside, Sarah found a tiny photograph on one side, all 5 children, arranged by height, with baby Hope perched on Samuel's lap. On the other side was a miniature portrait of Flynn himself, looking somewhat uncomfortable in his Sunday best, but handsome nonetheless. Oh, Flynn, Sarah breathed, tears welling in her eyes. It's beautiful. When did you? Had it made in Cheyenne last month when I went to sell those horses, Flynn explained. Thought you should have your whole family close to your heart. Sarah closed the locket carefully and handed it to him, turning so he could fasten it around her neck. The weight of it felt right against her skin, a tangible reminder of the precious life they had built together. Thank you, she whispered, turning back to him. I'll treasure it always. Flynn smiled, brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. Sarah Callahan, you and those children are the best things that ever happened to me. I thank God every day for whatever twist of fate led me to those train tracks that night. Sarah leaned into his embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "So do I," she murmured. "So do I." As they rocked gently on the porch swing, looking out over the ranch that was their kingdom, Sarah reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought them here. From the depths of despair beside those lonely train tracks to this moment of perfect contentment, every step, even the painful ones, had been necessary to reach this place. Her children, once sleeping fearfully beside the tracks with hunger in their bellies and uncertainty in their hearts, now rested peacefully in warm beds, secure in the knowledge that they were loved, protected, and home. And Sarah herself, once a desperate widow with nothing left to lose, had found not just shelter but a love so deep and true it still took her breath away. "Come home with me," Flynn had said that fateful night, and in accepting his offer, Sarah had found not just a home but a future brighter than any she could have imagined.